"Get in the car." The voice was a low, gravelly command cutting through the howling winter wind. Leah shivered violently, her thin diner uniform offering zero protection against the relentless snow. She looked up, her lips blue, eyes wide with exhaustion and terror. The man standing over her wore a dark cashmere coat that cost more than she made in a decade. His dark eyes betrayed a dangerous, quiet power. I said, "Get in the car. You're going to freeze to death on this bench." He didn't ask. He stated an absolute fact. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in the city knew Thomas. He was a monster. But tonight, the monster was offering warmth. Yes, howled like a wounded animal through the concrete canyons of the city, carrying with it shards of ice that bit into Leah's exposed skin. It was 3 in the morning, the kind of absolute dead-of-night hour where the city finally surrendered to the elements. The streetlights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the accumulating snowbanks. Leah sat huddled on the slatted metal bench of the bus station, her knees pulled tightly to her chest in a desperate, futile attempt to conserve whatever body heat she had left. Her uniform, a cheap polyester blend dress in a faded mustard yellow, was practically paper against the sub-zero gale. She had wrapped her thin, frayed cardigan around her shoulders, but it was completely soaked through from the sleet that had fallen earlier in the evening. Her shift at the diner had ended at midnight, but the buses had stopped running hours ago due to the severe weather warnings. She had nowhere else to go. Earlier that afternoon, she had returned to her cramped, damp apartment, only to find her belongings tossed onto the sidewalk in garbage bags and a padlock on the door. Her landlord hadn't cared about the winter storm warning. He hadn't cared that she was only 2 weeks behind on rent. And now, she was entirely, utterly alone. The numbness had started in her toes an hour ago, creeping slowly up her ankles, turning her legs into heavy blocks of wood. Her teeth chattered so violently that her jaw ached, and a terrifying, seductive drowsiness was beginning to pull at the edges of her consciousness. She knew what that meant. She knew that if she closed her eyes, she would not open them again. Then, the blinding headlights cut through the swirling snow. A massive, matte black SUV rolled to a silent stop against the curb, its tires crushing the fresh snow with a heavy, deliberate crunch. The engine idled with a deep, powerful purr that vibrated through the frozen pavement. Leah blinked against the glare, her sluggish mind struggling to process what was happening. The rear passenger door opened, and a figure stepped out into the storm. It was Thomas. Even through her haze of freezing despair, the recognition sent a sharp spike of adrenaline straight into her heart. Thomas didn't just walk. He commanded the space around him. He was a man spoken of in hushed, terrified whispers in the back booths of the diner where she worked. He was the undisputed king of the city's underworld, a man whose legitimate businesses were merely elegant fronts for an empire built on ruthless efficiency and terrifying power. He stood tall, his broad shoulders easily bearing the weight of an immaculate charcoal-gray cashmere overcoat. The snow seemed to avoid him, or perhaps it simply melted instantly upon contact with his overwhelming presence. He took 2 steps toward the bench, his leather shoes making no sound. Leah tried to press herself further back into the cold metal of the bench, a trapped animal trying to disappear into the wall. Her breath plumed in ragged, shallow gasps. She had never spoken to him, though she had seen him. He came into the diner sometimes, always sitting in the corner booth, always surrounded by silent, broad-shouldered men. He tipped well, but no one ever dared look him directly in the eye. Now, his dark, piercing eyes were locked entirely on her. "Get in the car," he said. The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that cut cleanly through the roar of the wind. Leah's jaw trembled, both from the cold and the sheer, paralyzing terror gripping her chest. She tried to speak, to form the words to say she was fine, to politely decline the most dangerous man in the city. But her vocal cords refused to cooperate. Only a pathetic, broken squeak escaped her blue lips. Thomas stepped closer. The proximity was suffocating. She could smell the faint scent of expensive cedarwood cologne mixing with the sharp tang of the ozone and snow. His expression was completely unreadable, a mask of carved stone. He didn't look pitying. He didn't look predatory. He looked intensely, clinically observant. He looked down at her bare legs, the ruined nylons, the cheap canvas sneakers that were currently packed with ice. A microscopic tightening at the corner of his jaw was the only indication that he was experiencing any emotion at all. "You are going to freeze to death on this bench in less than 20 minutes, Thomas stated, his voice completely devoid of inflection. It was a cold, hard fact. My car is 80 degrees. The choice is yours, but I suggest you make it quickly." Leah's survival instinct, dormant and freezing just moments ago, suddenly screamed to life. The man standing before her was a known criminal, a dealer in violence and shadow, but the cold was a guaranteed killer. The wind whipped violently again, slashing across her face, and a wave of dizzying darkness washed over her vision. She was dying. She knew she was dying. Slowly, agonizingly, she unclasped her arms from around her knees. Her joints screamed in protest, stiff and agonizingly painful, as she tried to force her body to move. She managed to plant her feet on the icy pavement, but the moment she tried to put weight on them, her knees buckled. Before she could hit the ground, Thomas moved. He was impossibly fast for a man of his size. His hands, clad in supple black leather gloves, caught her by the upper arms. The grip was iron-strong but remarkably steady, holding her upright with effortless strength. He didn't linger, didn't hold her inappropriately. He simply bore her weight, turning her toward the open door of the SUV. The heat radiating from the vehicle hit her face like a physical wall, thick and overwhelmingly wonderful. With a gentle but firm push, Thomas guided her into the cavernous, leather-lined interior of the back seat. She collapsed onto the plush seats, her body folding into a shivering, pathetic pile. Thomas climbed in silently beside her, pulling the heavy door shut and sealing them inside. The roar of the storm was instantly muted to a distant, muffled whisper. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. The interior of the SUV was a sanctuary of impossible luxury, a stark, jarring contrast to the brutal, unforgiving world Leah had just been dragged from. The air was thick with the rich, intoxicating scent of premium leather and the faint, residual aroma of expensive cigars. Heat blasted from multiple vents, washing over Leah's shivering frame in continuous, life-saving waves. But the warmth brought its own kind of agony. As the blood began to violently force its way back into her frozen extremities, her hands and feet began to burn with a fierce, agonizing, prickling sensation, as if 1,000 tiny needles were being driven into her skin. She curled tighter into herself, pressing herself against the far door, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the man sitting on the opposite side of the expansive bench seat. She buried her face in her hands, trying to stifle the quiet, ragged sobs of pain and overwhelming stress that were fighting their way up her throat. Thomas sat in absolute stillness. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. He simply stared straight ahead through the heavily tinted divider that separated them from the driver. The ambient light from the street lamps passed over his face in rhythmic intervals as the SUV glided smoothly through the snow-choked streets, illuminating the sharp, harsh angles of his jaw and the deep, calculating intelligence in his eyes. "Drive," Thomas commanded softly. The word was directed at the front, and the heavy vehicle immediately pulled away from the curb, moving with a silent, imposing grace. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Leah's violent shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. But she fought the sleep. She couldn't sleep. She was in a car with a mafia boss. The reality of her situation was beginning to dawn on her, cutting through the fog of the cold. Why had he stopped? What did he want? Men like Thomas did not perform random acts of charity. Every favor had a price, every action a calculated return on investment. What could she possibly have that a man who owned half the city could want? Finally, the agonizing silence was broken. "There is a blanket in the compartment beneath your seat," Thomas said. His voice was calm, perfectly modulated, but it still made Leah jump. She fumbled blindly beneath the seat, her numb fingers brushing against something soft. She pulled out a thick, woven cashmere throw. It was softer than anything she had ever touched in her life. With shaking hands, she draped it over her shoulders, pulling it tightly around her trembling frame. The immediate comfort it provided was almost offensive in its luxury. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first word she had spoken, and it sounded pathetic, small, and fragile in the heavy silence of the car. Thomas slowly turned his head to look at her. His gaze was analytical, stripping away her defenses without a shred of effort. "What is your name?" "Leah," she answered instantly, the truth slipping out before she could even think to construct a lie. "Leah," Thomas repeated, tasting the syllables. "You work at the diner on 4th and Elm. You take the closing shifts. You usually catch the 1:15 a.m. bus." Leah's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes went wide, staring at him in unadulterated horror. How did he know that? She had never served his table. She had always made sure to hide in the back near the dish pit whenever his heavy, imposing crew walked through the doors. "I notice things," Thomas said, correctly interpreting the sheer panic written across her face. "It is my business to know the rhythms of my city, the people who inhabit it. The diner is on my route. I have seen you waiting at that stop before. Why were you still there at 3 in the morning during a blizzard warning?" Leah swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly in her lap. The shame of her reality washed over her, hot and humiliating. The buses stopped running. I didn't know until my shift ended. I tried to walk, but the wind. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "You have a home," Thomas stated. It wasn't a question. Tears welled up in Leah's eyes, hot and unbidden. She fought them back, refusing to cry in front of this man. "Not anymore," she whispered, the admission costing her every ounce of remaining dignity. "I was evicted today. My landlord changed the locks while I was at work. All my things are on the street." A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the car again. Thomas turned his gaze back to the window, watching the snow-covered city blur past. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply processed the information. Leah watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had laid her utter vulnerability bare before a predator. She waited for the trap to spring, for him to name his price for her rescue. But he remained silent. The SUV slowed, turning down a narrow, private alleyway that seemed hidden from the main thoroughfare. It descended down a steep ramp, the heavy metal doors of an underground garage rolling open automatically to receive them. The car pulled to a stop in the brightly lit, immaculately clean subterranean space. There were no other cars, just expansive concrete and glaring fluorescent lights. "We are here," Thomas said. Unbuckling his seatbelt, Leah clutched the cashmere blanket tighter around her shoulders, pure terror freezing her in place once more. "Where is here?" she asked. her voice trembling violently. "What are you going to do to me?" Thomas paused, his hand on the door handle. He looked back at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something deeply human in his gaze, a profound, weary understanding. "I'm going to buy you a cup of coffee, Leah," he said quietly, "and you are going to eat something. After that, we will decide what happens next. You are safe here. If I wanted to hurt you, I would have left you on that bench." He opened his door and stepped out into the garage. Leah sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the empty space he had occupied. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to bolt up the ramp and take her chances in the blizzard. But the memory of the freezing wind, the absolute certainty of death on that bench, rooted her to the spot. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she slid across the leather seat and stepped out of the car, following the shadow into the unknown. The private elevator from the garage opened directly into what looked like a high-end, classic American diner, but perfectly preserved in amber. The chrome gleamed flawlessly, the red leather booths were entirely uncracked, and the black and white checkered floor was spotless enough to eat off of. It was completely empty, save for an older man behind the counter wearing a pristine white apron, diligently wiping down an espresso machine. The front windows, which should have looked out onto a street, were heavily tinted, completely blacking out the storm raging outside. It was a sanctuary hidden beneath the skin of the city. Thomas walked to a booth in the far corner, a habit clearly ingrained in his bones, and slid into the seat. He gestured casually to the opposite side. Leah approached cautiously, her wet sneakers squeaking softly against the linoleum. She slid into the booth, her body still tightly wound with residual fear, clutching the cashmere blanket around her like a protective shield. The man behind the counter approached immediately, placing 2 thick, heavy ceramic mugs on the table. He didn't ask for an order. He simply poured steaming black coffee from a glass carafe into both mugs, set down a small pitcher of cream, and retreated to the kitchen without uttering a single word. "Drink," Thomas commanded gently. Leah didn't hesitate this time. She wrapped both hands around the scalding mug, letting the heat seep into her palms. She brought it to her lips and took a tentative sip. It was the best coffee she had ever tasted. Rich, dark, and perfectly brewed. It slid down her throat, warming her from the inside out. She closed her eyes for a brief second, letting out a soft, involuntary sigh. When she opened her eyes, Thomas was watching her. He hadn't touched his own cup. He sat with his hands resting lightly on the table, his posture relaxed but radiating an undeniable, coiled energy. "Tell me about the eviction," he said. It wasn't a request for a story. It was a demand for the fact. Leah swallowed hard, staring into the dark depths of her coffee. The shame was suffocating, but the terrifying authority of the man across from her compelled her to speak. "I fell behind," she started, her voice low. "Just 2 weeks. I had the money, most of it anyway. But," she hesitated, her throat tightening. "But?" Thomas prompted, his voice a low rumble. "But my ex-boyfriend," she forced the words out, the bitterness evident on her tongue. "He knew where I kept my cash tips. He broke in while I was at the diner 3 days ago and took it all. The rent money, the grocery money, everything. When I told the landlord, he didn't care. He said my drama wasn't his problem. I came home tonight, and the locks were changed." Thomas's expression remained entirely impassive, but his eyes darkened, a subtle hardening of his features that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. "Did you call the police regarding the theft?" Leah let out a hollow, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "The police? I live in the Narrows, Mr. Thomas. The police don't come for stolen tip money. And even if they did, Marcus, my ex, he's gone. He's a ghost when he wants to be. Marcus. Thomas repeated the name, filing it away with mechanical precision. What does he do? He drinks, he gambles, he steals from me, Leah said, the exhaustion finally stripping away her polite filters. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Look, why do you care? Why are you asking me this? You don't know me. You're who you are. Why did you pick me up? Thomas slowly reached out and picked up his coffee cup. He took a measured sip, his gaze never leaving hers. I picked you up because I do not like waste. A life freezing on a park bench is a waste. He set the cup down. When I was young, much younger than you, I spent a winter sleeping in the subways. I know what that cold feels like. It is a cold that gets into your bones and stays there for the rest of your life. I saw you sitting there, and I recognized the look in your eyes, the look of someone who has realized that the world simply does not care if they vanish. Leah sat stunned. The admission was startlingly intimate, completely at odds with the terrifying persona he projected to the world. For a fleeting moment, she didn't see the mafia boss. She saw a ghost of a starving, freezing boy hidden beneath the expensive suit and absolute power. Before she could respond, the kitchen doors swung open. The silent man emerged carrying a large oval plate laden with food. He set it down gently in front of Leah. It was a massive, perfectly cooked steak, flanked by a mountain of steaming mashed potatoes and bright green asparagus. The smell was intoxicating, triggering a violent rumble in Leah's empty stomach. She hadn't eaten since breakfast the previous day. Eat, Thomas instructed. Leah looked from the plate to Thomas, her pride warring briefly with her overwhelming hunger. Hunger won. She picked up the heavy silver knife and fork and began to cut into the meat. The first bite was a revelation. She ate quickly, desperately, abandoning whatever table manners she possessed. She practically inhaled the food, driven by a primal need to consume calories. Thomas watched her eat in complete silence. He didn't eat himself. He simply observed, a strange, unreadable calm settling over him. By the time Leah finally set her fork down, the plate was entirely clean. She sat back, her stomach aching comfortably, a wave of profound lethargy washing over her. The adrenaline crash was imminent. I can't pay you for this, Leah mumbled, her eyelids drooping heavily. I don't have a single dollar to my name. I am not a restaurant, Leah. I do not issue checks, Thomas replied smoothly. He glanced at a heavy gold watch on his wrist. It is nearly 5 in the morning. You are exhausted. You require sleep. Panic flared briefly in Leah's chest again. I can't stay here. I'll go to a shelter. When the buses start. The shelters in this district are full, and they are not safe for a woman alone, especially one who is exhausted, Thomas stated, with absolute finality. He stood up from the booth, his presence instantly dominating the room again. You are coming with me. Leah's hands gripped the edge of the table. With you? Where? Upstairs, Thomas said simply. To my home. You will sleep. When you wake up, your mind will be clear, and we will discuss a permanent solution to your problem. Come. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the casual authority of a man who was entirely unaccustomed to being told no. Leah looked at the empty plate in front of her, the lingering warmth of the coffee, and the terrifying, commanding man waiting for her. She had no money, no home, and no one to call. She was entirely at his mercy. Slowly, resigning herself to whatever fate awaited her, she stood up and followed him toward the private elevator. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime, revealing a penthouse that defied Leah's comprehension. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, God's-eye view of the city. though the view was currently obscured by the swirling vortex of the ongoing blizzard. The space was aggressively modern, a breathtakingly beautiful fortress suspended in the sky. Thomas stepped out, tossing his heavy cashmere coat over a sleek leather sofa. The security system is armed. The doors are locked. No one comes up here without my explicit authorization, he said, turning to face her. Leah stood awkwardly by the elevator, the borrowed blanket clutched tightly around her shoulders. She felt profoundly out of place. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice a fragile whisper in the vast, echoing space. "I told you, I dislike waste. You are currently a wasted asset. You survive, yet you are left to freeze on the street because of the actions of a parasite. I find that unacceptable," Thomas replied smoothly, gesturing down a softly lit hallway. "Come." He led her to a guest bedroom. A massive king-sized bed dominated the center, and a private, marble-lined bathroom was visible to the right. "This is your room," Thomas said. "There are clean clothes in the dresser. The bathroom is fully stocked. Sleep for as long as you need." Leah stepped tentatively into the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She had to ask. Men did not offer things like this for free. "And what do you want in return, Thomas?" she asked, trying to project a bravery she did not feel. "I need to know the price." Thomas's expression darkened, a sudden, sharp coldness flashing in his eyes. He took half a step forward, his immense presence filling the doorway. "Let me be entirely clear with you, Leah," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low timbre. "I do not buy people. I do not exploit desperate women for my amusement. If you believe for 1 second that I brought you here to extract some sort of physical payment, you are gravely insulting both of us. You are here because you were dying, and I chose not to let that happen. That is the entirety of the transaction." The absolute ironclad sincerity in his voice hit Leah like a physical blow. I'm sorry," she stammered, looking down. I'm not used to kindness." "I am not a kind man, Leah," he corrected her softly. "Do not mistake what I do for kindness. Lock the door from the inside if it helps you sleep. I will not disturb you." He stepped back into the hallway, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. The satisfying, solid click of the latch echoed in the quiet room. Leah stood alone. With trembling fingers, she engaged the heavy deadbolt, her legs suddenly giving way as she sank to the floor. After a brief, overwhelming release of tears for the terrors of the night and everything she had lost, she forced herself up. A scalding shower washed away the grime, the freezing chill, and the lingering stench of fear. Wrapped in soft, borrowed clothes, she crawled beneath the heavy duvet. The storm still raged violently outside, but inside it was warm, silent, and safe. Within minutes, the dark, heavy blanket of sleep pulled her under, plunging her into a deep, dreamless oblivion. Leah woke to the complete absence of sound. The howling wind that had battered the windows the night before had ceased, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence. She blinked open her eyes, momentarily disoriented by the vast, luxurious ceiling above her. It took a few terrifying seconds for the memories of the previous night to crash over her: the freezing bench, the black SUV, the diner, and the terrifying, imposing figure of Thomas. She sat up slowly, the high-quality cotton sheets pooling around her waist. She felt physically better. The deep, bone-aching chill was entirely gone, replaced by a lingering lethargy. She glanced at the digital clock on the bedside table. It read 1:45 p.m. She had slept for nearly 9 hours. Pushing the heavy duvet aside, she swung her legs out of bed. The thick carpet was soft under her bare feet. She walked to the window and touched the button on the wall panel. The heavy blackout curtains glided open smoothly, revealing a city transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a brilliant, blindingly bright winter day. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, and the city below was buried under nearly 2 feet of pristine, untouched snow. It looked peaceful, clean, and entirely deceptive. Leah took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She couldn't stay in this room forever. She had to face him. She had to figure out what happened next. She unlocked the heavy bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway. The penthouse was utterly silent. She walked slowly down the hall, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood floors. As she neared the expansive, open-concept living area, she heard a voice. It wasn't Thomas's deep rumble, but a higher-pitched, frantic cadence that reeked of pure panic. She stopped, pressing her back flat against the wall just outside the living room archway, her heart rate instantly spiking. "I swear to God, boss, I didn't know the count was short," the panicked voice pleaded. The shipment arrived late. The docks were a mess because of the storm. "I just loaded the crates and signed the manifest. I didn't open them. I wouldn't steal from you. You know me, Thomas. I've been with you for 5 years." Leah held her breath, creeping slightly closer to peek around the corner. Thomas was sitting in a high-backed leather armchair, his posture relaxed, his legs crossed. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit without a tie, looking every inch the corporate CEO. Standing in front of him was a man in his late 30s, his clothes disheveled, sweat visibly pouring down his pale face, despite the cool temperature of the penthouse. 2 massive, silent men in dark suits, the same kind of men Leah saw at the diner, stood on either side of the panicked man, their hands clasped loosely in front of them. Thomas didn't speak immediately. He simply stared at the man, letting the silence stretch and pull until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. The terrified man began to tremble. 5 years, Thomas finally said, his voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of anger. "You have been with me for 5 years. That means you should know better than anyone that I do not tolerate incompetence, and I certainly do not tolerate theft. $50,000 of product is missing from a sealed crate that was exclusively under your supervision." "I didn't take it," the man practically shrieked, falling to his knees on the immaculate rug. "Please, Thomas. It must have been the crew at the docks. They knew the storm was coming. They knew everything was chaotic. They skimmed it." Thomas slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes locking onto the weeping man. "I have already spoken to the dock foreman," Thomas said quietly. "He showed me the security footage. You diverted crate number 4 to a secondary loading bay, out of sight of the main cameras, for exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes is ample time to remove $50,000 of product and seal the crate back up." The man on his knees froze, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The lie had been expertly dissected and exposed in seconds. "You have a gambling problem, Marcus," Thomas stated, the name sending a violent shockwave through Leah's hidden body. Marcus. It was a common name, but the coincidence was terrifying. "You owe $70,000 to the Petrovs. You stole from me to pay them so they wouldn't break your legs. Please," the man sobbed, his head bowing entirely. "They were going to kill me, and what did you think I would do?" Thomas asked softly. The sheer, chilling apathy in his voice was infinitely more terrifying than any shouting. Leah couldn't breathe. She was witnessing the reality of Thomas's world, the brutal, unforgiving machine that operated beneath the city. She squeezed her eyes shut, terrified of what she was about to hear. The sound of a gunshot? The sickening crunch of bone? "Take him," Thomas commanded quietly. Leah flinched. The 2 massive guards stepped forward, grabbing the weeping man by his arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. "Wait, please, Thomas, please." The man screamed as they dragged him toward the private elevator. He is not to be harmed physically. Thomas's voice cut through the screaming, stopping the guards in their tracks. Take his keys. Empty his apartment. Take his car. Confiscate any assets he possesses to cover the 50,000. Tell the Petrovs his debt is no longer protected by my name. They can do what they wish with him. Then put him on a bus out of the state. If I ever see him in this city again, the consequences will be final. Yes, sir. One of the guards rumbled. They dragged the sobbing, broken man into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off his cries instantly. The penthouse descended into silence once more. Leah remained frozen against the wall, her mind reeling. He hadn't killed the man. He hadn't even had him beaten. He had systematically destroyed his life with surgical precision, leaving him with absolutely nothing to be hunted by others. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply ruthless form of justice. You can come out now, Leah. Thomas's voice echoed softly through the room. The wall is not thick enough to hide your breathing. Leah's stomach plummeted. She slowly stepped out from behind the archway, her hands nervously twisting the hem of the oversized t-shirt. She stood in the center of the vast living room, feeling entirely exposed and profoundly terrified. Thomas didn't look angry that she had been eavesdropping. He remained seated in his armchair, observing her with that same clinical gaze. You slept well, he noted. You destroyed him, Leah stammered, unable to stop the words from spilling out. I balanced a ledger. Thomas corrected her smoothly. He made a choice. He stole from me. In my world, actions have immediate and severe consequences. If I allow theft, I project weakness. If I project weakness, my empire crumbles, and the violence that would follow in the power vacuum would tear this city apart. I maintain order. That requires discipline. He stood up, walking toward a sleek, wet bar in the corner of the room. He poured a glass of sparkling water and walked over to hand it to her. Leah took it with shaking hands. You are afraid of me again, Thomas observed quietly, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. You saw the monster they whisper about in your diner. Leah looked up into his dark eyes. She expected to see cruelty, but she only saw a heavy, isolating burden. I saw a man who is incredibly dangerous, she whispered honestly. Thomas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That is accurate. I am dangerous. But I am not dangerous to you, Leah. Come and sit. We need to discuss your future. Thomas gestured toward the expensive leather sofa. Leah sat down carefully, perched on the absolute edge of the cushion, clutching her glass of water tightly. Thomas took the armchair opposite her, his posture entirely relaxed, commanding the space without effort. Your apartment is gone, Thomas began, cutting straight to the reality of the situation. Your money is gone. Your employment at that diner is a dead end that will barely keep you above the poverty line, even if you work double shifts. You require a new trajectory. Leah stared at him, a defensive spark finally igniting in her chest. I don't need charity, Thomas. I'll find another apartment. I'll pick up extra shifts. I know how to survive. Surviving is not living, Thomas countered smoothly. Surviving is freezing on a bus bench because you missed a connection. I am not offering you charity. I am offering you an opportunity. A transaction. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees. I own a considerable amount of legitimate real estate in this city. Restaurants, bakeries, supply companies. They function as clean revenue streams. One of my properties, a high-end bakery and cafe in the financial district, requires a new general manager. The previous manager was let go due to bookkeeping irregularities. Leah blinked, trying to process the rapid shift in conversation. You want me to manage a bakery? I wait tables, Thomas. I don't know the first thing about managing a business, dealing with suppliers, or handling payroll. You know how to work hard, Thomas stated, his eyes locking onto hers with intense certainty. You know how to handle high-stress situations. You know how to deal with difficult people. The administrative skills can be taught. I have accountants to handle the complex ledgers. What I need on the floor is someone who is loyal, observant, and desperate enough to not fail. I believe you are all three. Leah gripped her glass tighter. And why would I be loyal to you? Because you saved my life? Yes, Thomas said bluntly. And because I will pay you a salary that is 3 times what you made at that diner. I will provide you with a secure, furnished apartment in one of my residential buildings. Your rent will be automatically deducted from your salary at a highly subsidized rate. You will have health insurance. You will have a career. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, but the rope was attached to a predator. Leah's mind raced. If she walked out the door now, she was back on the snowy streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. If she accepted, she was binding herself to a criminal empire, even if her specific job was legitimate. What happens if I fail? She asked, her voice quiet. Do you have your men drag me out of my apartment and put me on a bus out of state? A ghost of a smile touched the corner of Thomas's mouth. It was a rare, startlingly handsome expression. If you fail because you are incapable, you will simply be fired. If you fail because you steal from me, well, you saw what happens. The smile vanished, replaced by deadly seriousness. But you will not steal from me, Leah. You know what it is like to have nothing. You will not risk returning to that. He was right. He had diagnosed her core motivation perfectly. I'll take the job, Leah said, the decision solidifying in her chest. It wasn't a choice made out of bravery, but out of necessity. Good, Thomas said, standing up. A driver will take you to your new apartment in 1 hour. You will find a phone and a laptop there, along with instructions. Your training begins tomorrow at 6 in the morning. Do not be late. The next few weeks were a blur of exhausting, relentless work. The bakery, named The Gilded Crust, was a massive, bustling operation that catered to the city's wealthy elite. Leah was thrown into the deep end. She had to learn the inventory systems, manage a staff of 20 temperamental bakers and baristas, and handle the demanding, entitled clientele. She worked 14-hour days, going home to her new, immaculate apartment, only to sleep. But she thrived. Thomas had been right. The sheer desperation to never end up on a freezing bench again fueled her. She tightened the supply chains, reorganized the scheduling to maximize efficiency, and dealt with customer complaints with a firm but polite steel that surprised even herself. Thomas did not make his presence obvious. He never formally visited the bakery during her shifts, but she felt his shadow. Once a week, a black SUV would park across the street for exactly 10 minutes before driving away. Occasionally, his massive, silent guards would come in, order a single black coffee, tip a $100 bill, and leave without a word. It was his way of checking in, a silent reminder that she was under his protection and his scrutiny. One rainy Tuesday evening, just as Leah was locking up the shop, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. The rear window rolled down, revealing Thomas in the dim light. "Get in," he said. Leah felt a familiar spike of anxiety, but it was muted now, replaced by a strange, cautious trust. She slid into the back seat. "The quarterly reports were sent to my desk today," Thomas said without preamble as the car pulled away. "Revenue is up 12%. Waste is down by 20%. You have stabilized the staff turnover." "I told you I wouldn't fail," Leah replied, a note of hard-earned pride in her voice. She wasn't the terrified, freezing girl anymore. She was wearing a tailored suit, her hair pulled back sharply, exuding competence. Thomas looked at her, his eyes tracing the subtle changes in her posture and demeanor. "You have exceeded my expectations, Leah. You have proven to be a highly capable asset. Is that all I am? An asset?" she challenged, emboldened by her success. Thomas was silent for a long moment. He looked out the window at the passing city lights. "In my world, assets are the only things that have value. But some assets are worth more than the numbers on a ledger." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "You have built a life for yourself in 3 months. I merely provided the foundation. The structure is yours." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her, and it carried more weight than 1,000 empty praises. They sat in a comfortable silence for the rest of the ride. A bond was forming between them, not a romance, but a profound, unspoken mutual respect. They were both survivors of a brutal world, operating on different sides of the line, but understanding each other perfectly. 6 months passed. The bakery became one of the most profitable legitimate enterprises in Thomas's portfolio, entirely due to Leah's relentless dedication. She had transformed the space from a mere front into a genuinely beloved neighborhood institution. She had money in the bank, a closet full of clothes she bought herself, and a profound sense of security she had never known in her entire life. She had begun to let her guard down, foolishly believing that the ghosts of her past were permanently exorcised. It was a busy Friday afternoon. The cafe was packed with businessmen grabbing late lunches and wealthy patrons lingering over expensive pastries. Leah was behind the counter, helping the baristas clear a sudden rush of orders. She was laughing at a joke one of her staff made, wiping down the espresso machine, completely focused on the rhythm of the work. Then, the bell above the door chimed, and the temperature in Leah's blood dropped to absolute zero. He looked exactly the same, perhaps a little more disheveled, a little more desperate. Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had stolen her rent money and left her to freeze. He was wearing a dirty jacket, his eyes darting frantically around the opulent cafe, looking wildly out of place among the bespoke suits and designer bags. He spotted her instantly. A cruel, triumphant sneer spread across his face, revealing stained teeth. He pushed his way past a woman in a silk blouse, ignoring her indignant gasp, and marched directly toward the counter. "Well, well, well," Marcus sneered, leaning heavily against the pristine glass of the pastry display case. He smelled of stale beer and unwashed clothes. "Look at you moving up in the world. From a greasy diner to playing manager at a fancy bakery. You look good, Lee. Real good." Leah froze, the damp cloth slipping from her fingers. The confident, capable manager vanished in an instant, replaced by the terrified, abused girl she used to be. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice dropping, taking on a menacing, familiar edge. "It wasn't easy. You just vanished. But I heard whispers. Someone saw you walking into a fancy building downtown. Took me weeks to track you down to this little gold mine." "You need to leave," Leah said, trying to force steel into her voice, but it cracked pathetically. "You can't be here." "I'll leave when I get what I came for." Marcus snapped, his eyes flashing with sudden anger. He leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "I'm in trouble, Lee. Bad trouble. I owe people a lot of money, and they ain't the forgiving type. I need cash, today. And seeing as how you're running this place, I know there's a safe in the back." "I don't have access to the safe," Leah lied desperately, her eyes darting toward the door. "And even if I did, I wouldn't give you a dime. You stole everything from me. You nearly got me killed." Marcus's face twisted in rage. He reached across the counter, his hand shooting out like a snake, and grabbed her roughly by the wrist. His grip was agonizingly tight, grinding the bones together. "Listen to me, you ungrateful bitch," he hissed, pulling her forcefully toward the glass. "You owe me. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't be here. You're going to go in the back, and you're going to empty that safe, or I swear to God I will make a scene right here that will get you fired so fast your head will spin. And then I'll find you when you're back on the street." Leah winced in pain, trying to pull her arm back, but he was too strong. Panic overwhelmed her. She was terrified of him, but she was entirely more terrified of what Thomas would do if money went missing. Before she could scream for security, a massive hand clamped down on Marcus's shoulder. It was one of the men in dark suits. He had been sitting in the corner booth reading a newspaper, completely unnoticed by Leah until this exact moment. The guard didn't say a word. He simply squeezed Marcus's shoulder. The pressure must have been immense, because Marcus's face instantly went pale, and he let out a sharp gasp of pain, releasing Leah's wrist immediately. "Is there a problem here, Miss Leah?" the guard asked, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. His eyes, however, were locked onto Marcus with predatory intensity. Marcus stumbled back, rubbing his shoulder, looking at the massive man in sudden terror. He recognized the type. Everyone in the city recognized Thomas's men. "No," Leah gasped, clutching her bruised wrist, her instinct to handle it herself overriding her fear. "No, there's no problem. He was just leaving. Right, Marcus?" Marcus looked from the guard to Leah, his bravado entirely shattered. He took another step back, his eyes wide with fear. Yeah? I was just leaving. I'll see you around, Lee." He turned and practically ran out the door, the bell chiming cheerfully in his wake. Leah slumped against the counter, shaking violently. The guard looked at her bruised wrist, his expression unchanging. "Are you injured?" he asked flatly. "I'm fine," Leah breathed, trying to compose herself. "Please, don't tell Thomas. It was nothing. I handled it. It won't happen again." The guard stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He pulled a small black phone from his pocket. "My orders are to report any physical contact made against you, Miss Leah. It is not a request." He turned away and dialed a number. Leah closed her eyes, a deep sense of impending doom washing over her. The ghost of her past had just invited the monster into his life, and she knew exactly how this was going to end. The anxiety gnawed at Leah's stomach for the rest of the day. She jumped at every chime of the door, expecting Thomas to walk in with an army, demanding answers. But the day ended quietly. The shop closed, the staff went home, and Leah was left alone to cash out the registers. The silence of the empty cafe was oppressive. She was counting the drawer when she heard the distinct, heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place on the front door. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Thomas was standing just inside the entrance. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. He wore dark jeans and a black turtleneck beneath a heavy leather jacket. He looked less like a businessman and entirely like the ruthless enforcer he had once been. His presence filled the room, sucking all the air out of the space. He walked slowly toward the counter. Leah stood frozen, her hands still clutching a stack of $20 bills. "Show me your wrist," Thomas demanded, his voice dangerously soft. Leah swallowed hard, hesitantly extending her left arm. A dark, ugly purple bruise in the shape of a handprint was already blooming across her pale skin. Thomas stopped in front of her, looking down at the bruise. The silence in the bakery was absolute. He didn't touch her, but the sheer, violent intensity radiating from him made Leah want to shrink back. The air around him felt physically hot. "His name is Marcus," Thomas stated quietly. "It wasn't a question. The man who stole your rent money. The man who put you on that bench." "Thomas, please," Leah begged, her voice trembling. "Don't hurt him. He's an idiot. He's desperate. But he's not worth killing." I handled it. He won't come back. Thomas slowly lifted his gaze from her wrist to her eyes. The coldness in his stare was absolute, a terrifying abyss of calculated malice. You do not understand how my world operates. Leah, violence is not about anger. It is about messaging. He touched what belongs to me. He brought chaos into a place of business that bears my protection. If I allow him to walk away, I invite every parasite in this city to test my boundaries. That will not happen. I don't belong to you. Leah suddenly snapped, surprising herself with her own audacity. I work for you. There's a difference. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. In the eyes of the city, there is no difference. You are under my umbrella. An attack on you is an attack on my sovereignty. He turned away from the counter, pulling a heavy file folder from his jacket. He tossed it onto a nearby table. I do not deal in mindless brutality, Leah. I deal in permanent solutions. Come with me. Leah hesitated, terrified of what he was planning, but she knew better than to refuse. She followed him to the back office. Thomas sat in the manager's chair and gestured for her to sit opposite him. 10 minutes later, the back door of the bakery opened, and two of Thomas's massive guards dragged a struggling, hyperventilating Marcus into the office. They threw him into a hard wooden chair opposite the desk. Marcus looked terrified, his eyes darting frantically around the room until they landed on Thomas. The blood drained entirely from his face. Mr. Thomas, Marcus whimpered, his voice cracking. I swear, I didn't know she was with you. I wouldn't have touched her. Please. Thomas leaned back in the chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at Marcus as if he were observing a particularly repulsive insect. You have a remarkable talent for making catastrophic decisions, Marcus. Thomas said smoothly. You steal from a woman who has nothing, leaving her to die in a blizzard. And then, when she is finally secure, you attempt to extort her in a place of business that I own. Thomas picked up the file folder he had brought and opened it. He began to read in a dry, clinical tone. Marcus Vance, you owe $40,000 to the Sullivan crew for gambling debts. You owe $15,000 to a loan shark in the Lower East Side. You have 2 outstanding warrants for petty theft and assault. Thomas closed the file and tossed it onto the desk. The loud smack made Marcus jump violently. Here is what is going to happen, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet register. I have purchased all of your debts. You do not owe the Sullivans. You do not owe the loan sharks. You owe me $55,000. Marcus's eyes went wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. Owing the Mafia boss was a death sentence. I don't have it, he sobbed. I can't pay that. I know you cannot, Thomas replied calmly. Which means I own you. Your life, your labor, your future. I am transferring you to a deep-water fishing vessel I operate off the coast of Alaska. The work is brutal, the conditions are freezing, and the mortality rate is unfortunately high. You will work there without pay until your debt is cleared. At your current earning potential, that will take approximately 14 years. Marcus began to violently thrash in the chair, screaming in panic. No, you can't do that. That's slavery. You can't just take me. Thomas leaned forward, the sudden, explosive malice in his eyes silencing Marcus instantly. I can do whatever I please in this city. You put your hands on my manager. You brought violence into my establishment. You will disappear tonight, Marcus. If you try to run, if you ever try to contact Leah again, I will not put you on a boat. I will bury you under the foundation of a new high-rise, and no one will ever look for you. Do you understand me? Marcus nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face, completely broken. Take him, Thomas commanded the guards. They hauled Marcus out of the chair and dragged him out the back door. The silence in the office returned, heavier than before. Leah sat frozen in her chair, staring at Thomas. Her heart was pounding, her mind struggling to process the sheer, terrifying power he wielded so casually. He hadn't touched Marcus. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply erased the man's life with a few sentences. "He will never bother you again," Thomas said quietly, standing up from the desk. "You're a monster," Leah whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Thomas stopped in the doorway, looking back at her. The expression on his face was one of profound, weary acceptance. "I told you that on the first night. Leah, I am a monster to the world, but I am the monster that keeps the wolves away from your door. Lock up when you leave. A car will be waiting to take you home." He walked out, leaving Leah alone in the quiet office. She looked down at her bruised wrist, then at the empty chair where her abuser had sat. Thomas was a monster. He was ruthless, calculating, and terrifying. But as she sat in the safety of the business he had given her, completely free of the fear that had haunted her for years, she realized a terrifying truth. She was profoundly grateful for him. A year had passed since the night of the blizzard. The Gilded Crust was no longer just a bakery. It was a cornerstone of the financial district, consistently pulling in record profits. Leah stood near the front counter, looking out over the bustling floor. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, her posture radiating quiet, unshakable confidence. The terrified, freezing girl in the cheap mustard uniform was completely gone, replaced by a formidable woman who commanded respect from her staff and her clientele alike. She checked her watch. It was exactly 2 p.m. The heavy glass door opened, and the usual hum of the cafe subtly quieted. Thomas walked in. He wore a perfectly cut slate-gray suit, his overcoat draped over one arm. He looked exactly the same as he did the first night she met him, imposing, dangerous, and utterly in control of the space around him. His 2 silent guards remained outside, taking positions by the door. Leah didn't flinch. She didn't feel the spike of terror that used to accompany his presence. She simply smiled, picking up a heavy ceramic mug and moving toward the espresso machine. Thomas walked to his usual table in the back corner, the one that offered a clear view of both entrances, and sat down. Leah approached a minute later, setting a steaming mug of black coffee in front of him, followed by a small plate holding a single, perfectly crafted almond croissant. "The quarterly reports look exceptional," Thomas said, taking a slow sip of the coffee. His eyes met hers, holding that familiar clinical intensity. "You have expanded the catering division significantly." "The corporate accounts are lucrative," Leah replied smoothly, sliding into the chair opposite him. She was the only person in the city who dared to sit at his table uninvited. "I'm looking into acquiring the empty storefront next door to expand the kitchen space. We are currently operating at maximum capacity." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "Draft a proposal. Have your accountant send it to my office by Friday. If the projections make sense, the capital will be provided." "It will make sense," Leah stated with absolute certainty. A brief, genuine smile touched the corner of Thomas's mouth. It was a look of quiet pride. "I do not doubt that it will." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the ambient noise of the busy cafe swirling around their isolated bubble of quiet. Leah watched him. She knew the terrible things he was capable of. She knew the blood and fear that paid for the suit he wore and the empire he ruled. She didn't excuse it, and she didn't romanticize it. But she also knew the man who had pulled a dying girl out of a blizzard and given her the tools to forge her own armor. "It's going to snow tonight," Leah said softly, looking out the large front window at the gray, heavy sky. The first real storm of the year. Thomas followed her gaze. His expression hardened slightly, the memories of that brutal night clearly playing behind his dark eyes. Yes. The forecasts predict a significant drop in temperature. I was thinking, Leah continued, her voice steady. When we close tonight, I want to take a company van and drive the route of the night buses in the Narrows. Bring blankets, hot coffee, some of the leftover pastries. Thomas looked back at her. His gaze was unreadable, heavy with unspoken weight. He didn't ask why. He didn't tell her it was a waste of time or resources. He understood perfectly. The Narrows is unpredictable during a storm, Thomas said quietly. It is not safe for you to go alone. I'm not asking for permission, Thomas, Leah replied gently but firmly. I'm just telling you. A long moment passed. The tension between them was not adversarial, but deeply respectful. Finally, Thomas gave a slow, definitive nod. I will send 2 of my men with you, he stated, leaving no room for argument. They will drive the van. They will ensure you are not bothered while you distribute the supplies. You will return before midnight. Leah smiled softly. It was his version of compromise. Thank you. Thomas finished his coffee and stood up, sliding his arms into his heavy coat. He looked down at her, the formidable woman she had become. You saved yourself, Leah, he said. His voice, a low rumble, meant only for her. Never forget that. I merely provided the heat. You chose to thaw. He turned and walked out of the bakery, his shadow stretching long across the floor before disappearing into the grey afternoon. Leah watched him go, feeling a profound sense of peace. She was no longer a victim of the cold, nor a prisoner of her savior. She was standing in the warmth of her own making, ready to face whatever storms the city had left to offer. True salvation doesn't come from a magical rescue, but from being given the tools and the safety to rebuild oneself. Kindness can be found in the darkest of places. But it is our own resilience that ultimately dictates our future. If you found this intense, dramatic story captivating, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional, cinematic stories that explore the complex shadows of human nature.